The recording and transcript will be published afterwards on the States Assembly website. All electronic devices, including mobile phones, please could you switch to silent. I would like to ask any members of the public who have joined us in the room today to not interfere in the proceedings, and as soon as the hearing is closed, please do leave quietly. And now for introductions. My name is Deputy Hilary Jean and I'm the Chair of the Environment, Housing and Infrastructure Scrutiny Panel.
Deputy Tom Coles, Vice Chair.
Deputy David Wall, Panel Member.
Deputy Alex Curtis, Panel Member.
Constable David Johnson, Panel Member.
Deputy Steve Luce, I'm Minister for the Environment.
Andy Skate, Chief Officer for Infrastructure and Environment.
Michelle Moffat, Policy Principal, Cabinet Office, working on a carbon neutral roadmap.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister. And we kick off in your response to the panel's budget launch letter. You stated that the proposed 2026 savings will severely undermine service delivery across the board. Which specific policy areas or functions will see reduced capacity as a result of the 750,000 staff-related savings?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, there's no doubt that next year is going to be challenging. The last few years we've been working hard to make sure that we stay inside budget which is continually under pressure. We are a department which relies very heavily on fees and charges for a good chunk of our income, and consequently we find ourselves under increasing pressure year on year, as I've said, and certain parts of the department, in fact all the way across the department, are going to be affected by the further cut of £750,000 next year. And I think it's fair to say that the effects will be felt, as I just said, across the whole department, regulation and environment. We are looking to make those savings by losing vacancy posts. And so where in certain parts across the department we have occasional vacancies, and that it is really across the whole gamut, we are in a position now where we're having to take those vacancies and not replace staff into those jobs in order to make our targeted cuts. As I said, we're a department that relies very heavily on fees and charges, but as a government we're determined to try to our best to not make the cost of living any worse. So we've decided there won't be any increase over 2.5%. And of course, as you know, we've introduced a consultancy and recruitment fees as well. So when you put all those factors together, things are very challenging, and without doubt, the effects are across the whole department. But I will just say this, which is in the Environment Department in particular, we have much smaller teams of maybe 2 or 3, maybe, where the manager, if you like, the knowledge, the really highly qualified people are part of a very small team. And if you reduce that team by 1, you know, it has a massive effect. So we will, I am sure, be challenged in the natural environment sector, where we will be having to have a really hard look at what we do and how we do it. Certainly, I'm conscious that when it comes to fees and charges, we are a government and a department that don't charge for many of the services that we provide. In the UK, you would pay for those services. But again, it's a challenge for me to try to push through with new charges in the light of the fact that we're in an era where we're trying not to add those additional charges to the general public. So there's lots to balance.
Thank you, Minister. I think some of those areas will go into a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I just want a quick question, Minister, and that is around private sector involvement in some of this area. Do you do a sort of a triage, basically, of what you're doing, and is there a possibility this could be done by the private sector as opposed to public sector?
Well, it was remiss of me, Deputy, to miss out one of the really crucial parts of natural environment is the amount of work that we get done by the third sector, by volunteers. And I mean, I cannot underestimate how grateful we are in the department for the work done by volunteers. And you can take Asian Hornets, for example, where we have a team of 30, 40, 50 people out there looking for them, tracking them, putting out the traps to see where they are, and actively helping us. But we have that across the whole gamut, where people are on the seashore doing surveys, out in the countryside doing so. And we have a huge range. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's somewhere nearly 500 people who help the natural environment team to do their work. So that's hugely important. I don't know that I could even think about asking them to do more because their input is so great already. And I know they respond really well to challenges. They're so helpful, but they also feel the pinch when we become, as a department, short of funds because they feel the effects of that as well.
I think it's important to say, if you look across the services within the environment portfolio, we are the statutory agencies for many things and we regulate the private sector. So in some of the areas of work we undertake, obviously it won't be, we regulate the private sector rather than expecting the private sector to do that work. So if I look at the regulation directorate, we're a regulator for many, many laws. The same could be said in our natural environment areas where we're the statutory authority for plant disease, pests, animal welfare, those sort of functions. So where we can partner up, but most of our partnerships, are, as the Minister said, are with the third sector and volunteers rather than with the private sector because we're statutory authorities.
I think it's important to stress that if you look at examples elsewhere out of the island where private sector have taken over government roles, and let's look at building control, for example, in the UK, that's a private sector job, if you like, and it hasn't necessarily gone well. And we need to guard about where we might use the private sector to do jobs which are currently undertaken by government officers.
And I think then coming back on that, because some of these areas I think we should kind of get into, but you've talked very clearly about the fact that in your department it's mainly about people. And doing this work, and then also having the third sector around to support those and needing that because the work it can't be done just from the department and staff alone. But you're saying that the main reduction or the main savings will be done by staff. But you've also noted recently that you had just rebuilt the staff to a functional level. Because we have been talking in our quarterly hearings about the fact that we have seen that the department has not been able to fulfil what has been wanted to do, and especially the priorities you wanted to do, Minister, when you came into office, because of that short of staff, because there wasn't to a functional level. Will we now see that functional level reducing again because of those reduction in staffs? Will it go back to being in a kind of crisis mode, I suppose, is what I'm trying to...
Well, I wouldn't call it crisis mode, but every post that we lose out of the department reduces our ability to do the amount of work we've done in previous years. So it must be said that reduced numbers doesn't make it easier to do all the work that we might wish to do, and that's where we will end up having to prioritise. The particular work you're referring to was work which was done in the policy team, which is Cabinet Office. But no, they also face the same challenges where we have officers fully employed with lots of stuff to do. And every time a new debate goes through the Assembly which has an effect on policy, that's additional work, and we then have to reprioritise because if something goes back to the top of the list, there will be something at the bottom of the list that falls off. So the only thing I would say in addition to that is, and to be fair to all sides, as a result of the CSP work, we were given additional staff to, I'm just trying to remember now, to undertake some of the work to do with affordable housing and the other bits that we were, carbon emissions and stuff like that. So we were granted a little bit of additional leeway in those two areas to get some staff for a short period of time to help us through that.
But that's because it was focused on CSP
Yes,
rather
absolutely.
than
It was a CSP priority, and therefore we were allowed a bit more operational leeway in those sections only.
And is, Minister, then that many of the areas that you were talking about regulation and about implementation, you've talked before about the need to work on things like Brexit, alignment and things. Those, of course, it's difficult because they're not necessarily wish lists or nice to haves. They're essential,
Yep.
but they may not necessarily be something that a government can put in a CSP because they're not necessarily strategic priorities. They're essential work. How does that balance happen when there are kind of like those political drivers of kind of strategic priorities and those that actually have to happen because or that regulation implementation or policy development or implementation because of Brexit? How does that
I mean,
balance work?
those type of things put us under increasingly great pressure. And you mentioned Brexit, but the one that certainly needs to be highlighted is the UK-EU reset negotiations, which are about to start. I think I'm correct I'm looking at my numbers here. 89 pieces of legislation will need to be modified if we're going to get involved with the UK, and the phyto and sanitary work needs to be done. We have a massive amount of work if we're going to bring our laws up to speed to engage and become part of the reset. That work is not costed or funded, or we haven't started on that because we don't actually know. We're not at that part of the negotiation where we know exactly what we've got to do yet. But what we do know is if we're going to get properly involved, there's a very, very big piece of work, not just for my department, where we will undoubtedly need some specialist help, because that's things that my officers wouldn't be capable of. And it will have also have a major effect on the law drafting team, because these are all laws which will need to be changed or written, modified, and it's all really currently unknown. We know it's coming, but the amount of work involved in it is at the moment unknown.
And would this be in this budget, or is this set to be seen in future budgets? As in, has this been communicated to the Council of Ministers about this piece of work? Because we're feeling that you're seeing these savings. We're hearing from you that the tightness of the budget. Yet these kind of aspects like this and the work that needs to be done, it will have a huge impact. Will this be the impact? Be under this budget, or is that seen as a future budget, and will that be accepted by the Council of Ministers as a not a nice to have, but as a necessity?
Okay, well, the first thing to say is I look to Andy, but I am pretty sure that there will be an impact on next year. I mean, I can't see how we would not have to start this work in earnest next year. As I said, it's not funded, but while I haven't brought it to the Council of Ministers as an official item on the agenda, certainly I've highlighted to the Council of Ministers in conversations during meetings, but sort of more off the cuff, if you like, rather than officially. But the amount of work we will have to do in this area could be immense, as and when it starts to materialise exactly what needs to be done. I mean, we're still in negotiations with the UK over it. They are yet to properly start their reset negotiations with the EU, but there is no doubt that we have a lot of work to do, and the officers have highlighted it to the Chief Executive, and we're all aware that it's coming. So it's not an unknown, it's a known unknown.
The first call upon resources will be our existing resources. So the first part of trying to balance that equation will be to look at our existing resources within the department and reprioritising them away from some areas of work into this area of work. If it becomes a hotter area of work and we have to respond in short order, then we will have to do that as a jurisdiction. That will mean that other areas of our work will be deprioritised accordingly. So that will be our first call, and we'll try and balance it that way. If we can't balance it that way, then we will need to have obviously a wider conversation around government as to where resources in government are sitting. But it is an unknown area of impact on our business that we certainly know is happening. There are other unknowns that we have to deal with, uncertainties I would call them, certainly around income levels, unplanned events such as weather events does affect the environment function as well. And then other things we have to respond to, such as disease outbreak, both statutory pest disease or animal health, plant health, or indeed even public health, because the environmental health and regulation teams do respond in that as well. So I guess it just typifies the uncertain context we live within.
I think Andy makes a really good point. I mean, I was going to use the word contingency. We don't have any contingency within our budget. And if we did, I would have raided it by now to try to help us out of the challenges elsewhere. But Andy's quite right. We don't have contingency. For example, Storm Kieran was a massive impact on the department. We had a lot of work we had to do. We received no additional funding for that. We were expected to cope with that inside our existing money, and other things like that. And you could, another pandemic, for example, would be something that the team would be expected to cope with. And in the immediate weeks and months of a pandemic, goodness, let's hope we never see one, but if we did have another one, all the work has to be undertaken by qualified people before we come up with a plan to see how we might cope further down the line. But certainly for the first few months, there's a massive impact on government from that sort of event. But I don't want particularly to use
I just wanted to really say, you're saying there's all this potential change. Is there a concrete example that you could point to and say, here's an example of where the legislation needs to change in line with the reset? Is there something you could say to the general public out there, this is what we mean when we talk about changing
I
legislation?
couldn't, off the top of my head, give you a single practical example, but I think the general
more like an
public and
unknown
everybody
event.
would realise that
Yeah.
the important thing about the reset is that we would need both laws on both sides of the equation to equate. And in many cases, I suspect the EU will be wanting us to have equivalent or equivalents. And that's where the challenge will come. Every law will have to be sifted through to make sure it comes up to the standards
Yeah,
required.
it's generally, laws for us specifically governing movement of animal products, food, trade, movement through the ports
So those are
that
the
we
kind of
regulate.
areas, these are the areas you're talking about,
Yeah,
which will
there's
be a
some very
reset.
specific
It's
areas.
all to do
where-
with trade.
It's all to do with trade, right?
And
okay.
there's statutory obligations in so many of those issues. So it will be once they are they are put in place, they also need to be implemented as well. And then many of that has
Yes,
to
absolutely.
be done in
And
the department
quite a
too.
lot of the work that my team do is got a lot of statutory obligations inside it. We also have a number, and I can't remember any of them specifically off the top of my head, but a number of conventions and stuff that we are expected to report into. And certainly for the last few years, we've coped with that, but we can see further down the line, there will be challenges on creating the data and the results to feed into these
And
environmental
how will
obligations
this
we have.
balance? I suppose we're just getting to the crux of how will with these cuts, how will I suppose Jersey try to minimise reputational risk or operational and environmental risk by not being able to, when Andy, you talked about having to put stuff down the list, because if there's the unknown known or the unknown is going to come, it means that there will be those choices to make. But if there are elements of the department that actually have to be, are under statutory obligations, how does those decisions be made within those wider things of reputational risks, operational and environmental risks?
Well, as a department, the officers will sit down and they'll sit down with me and we'll try to look at what we absolutely have to do. And I think the word obligation springs to mind, and the things you absolutely have to do, you have to do. And then you look at the list of stuff that doesn't necessarily have to be done. And this is where it really starts, if you like, to affect the perception from the public point of view, is that when you start to spend less time out in the countryside making things look good and making sure they're right and correct and footpaths are cut and things like that, those are the sort of areas, the sort of non-statutory areas. But even in footpaths, we are obliged to make sure that they are, as you would expect, that, we have a level that we have to get to make sure they're safe for the public to use. But it will always be a challenge to try to get everything to balance.
Can I just come back to the point about this idea with the new EU, this reset? I'm guessing this is going to have an inflationary impact on trade in Jersey. This will be about economic competitiveness as well. Is that going to be an issue?
Well, not necessarily my sector, but
Sorry,
I
I stepped away.
Yeah,
I know.
Okay. Can I just say, I
Step
don't know that it will have an inflationary effect, because the idea would be that we return to something we were used to pre-Brexit, which was much easier trade with Europe. And that, I would hope, would cut down on red tape and ease trade between
So you
us
see
and
as a
the
positive,
continent.
potential positive, yeah.
And I suppose my final question on this area is the growing. How do you administer and with this concerns that that the department hasn't been able to is having to save, but there's no growth at all in the department. But now even there has to be even more cuts, and there is also this growing calls for less regulation. But at the same time, we've got greater calls for more environmental protection, or, for example, from nut labelling, PFAS contamination and controls, and the landscape preservation. So how does the department balance those as well when you have the calls from potentially the many, and even within the government, to reduce regulation, but at the same time, on the other hand, we have the calls also that there needs to be regulation for health and environmental protection.
How do we do it? We do it with absolute great difficulty, I think, is the answer there. And you cite food regulation, and that's a good example. I mean, I've said to a number of States members recently that every time a new law goes through the States Assembly that requires regulation, nobody particularly considers the effect on the regulatory department of having to do their work, or the effect of people who find themselves regulated because of that law change. But we know, I mean, talking about food safety, I'm going to be coming to the Assembly very soon, certainly before the election, with the new food safety regulations. Now, that will mean that we are in a much better position to look at the way kitchens are used, the way that labelling is done, but there will be an effect. There's a cost to government of doing that work. Now, we know it's essential. We know we have to do it. It's really, really important that it's done. But there will be a cost, and we will look at the amount of charges we put onto those licences. And again, there's a conversation to have to making sure that we're not overly adding to the cost of living for residents of the island.
And I suppose that's what you were meaning when you said you're going to bring in potentially new charges rather than increasing current charges.
Well, new charges are very, very difficult to get approved. Let's be clear. I've got a number of areas where I feel that people should potentially be paying for services they are receiving. But at the moment, that's a real challenge for me to get that through, because the government, and this government that I'm part of, are trying hard not to add to the cost of living for islanders. So we have a number of areas that we would like to charge for. We have a number of areas where we'd like to charge more for. But at the moment, we're very much we're very much sticking to 2.5 where we can. And if I want to do more than that, I've got a large number of hurdles to get over before I'm allowed to increase further than that.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm just interested to follow up on the Chair's question on this section about the challenge. You said it's a very difficult challenge balancing competing demands, and one of them being calls for less regulation against a backdrop of you being the regulator or the regulation department. In identifying how to prioritise, are you looking at areas that your existing team and regulation department will regulate less or regulate differently in 2026 and 7 to compensate for areas where you need to regulate more?
Well, the first
Because ultimately,
thing to say is that I always face challenges to try to reduce regulation, and I don't want to be part of a government which regulates everything out of existence. So very much, but while none of us want regulation, we don't want regulation until we do want it, and then when we do want it, we really, really want it to be able to work, because it's all very well having a non-regulated society, but when things go down, you really wish you had it. So we do, at every turn, try to make sure we're reducing red tape, reducing duplication, and for existence, for example, the food law that we're just talking about will involve officers going in to regulate kitchens and cafes and what have you. But we're looking for ways to try to have that single visit to cover a multitude of different regulatory things. And also when it comes to applying for that food licence, to see whether there's a way we could apply for the food and the whole where you have an establishment that sells food and alcohol, do that at the same time. So as difficult as it is, we are trying to think up ways where we can reduce the amount of paperwork involved with regulation.
So is it fair to say that those are efficiencies in regulation rather than changing the level of regulation, perhaps in those areas? Because
I think that's probably fair to say. I mean, I would love to reduce regulation. The question is where and what part of island life do you want to regulate less? Because it's fine to regulate it less until something goes wrong, and then you suddenly realise we shouldn't have reduced.
That's a difficult equation. We're often in the balance of. We consult on reducing regulation, and obviously to reduce regulation per se, you need to reduce some statutes and repeal laws. If you don't repeal laws, there's a question about what you regulate within those laws. As much as we get calls for deregulation, we also get calls from other sectors of the economy and society to regulate more. So it is a constant balance. I guess an example live at the moment is just a consultation around the planning system that is live. Clearly, the island can have a planning system, whatever the planning system it wants, really. It can regulate what it wants in that system. But again, it's a difficult balance. We get many users of the system want more regulation, and many users want less regulation. So we try and tread a simple balance between the
permitted
two.
development is good that Andy raises planning, but permitted development is a classic example where people want to be able to do more without making an application. And it's very easy to put things on the general development order that they can do without an application. But you must always think about the consequences for the neighbour on both sides of the person who's put a large extension to the back of their home. And it's always really difficult to find ways to reduce regulation, especially in that area.
Yeah, a brief comment, just feeding off Deputy Kirsty's comment. Is a distinction made between increasing fees and perhaps increasing penalties under the present system, which is fairer, and possibly looking at the introduction of civil penalties rather than criminal, where I sense criminal procedures are not often taken, or procedures aren't taken because it is a criminal nature.
I mean, this is not really a budget issue, but if you want
to
talk about criminal and civil, yes, we have a very classic example at the moment in statutory nuisance where we don't have a civil, and it will be a good idea for the next minister particularly to start thinking about civil rather than criminal, because getting over that bar is much easier for people to do. Talking about fees and charges and penalties, certainly in the department, I have asked a couple of times whether, I'm trying to think, there's fixed penalty notices that apply to parking could be applied to other offences. And it may be that at some point in the future, not now because we're not talking about it, but it may be in the future that might be a way of trying to do things, but that's not something.
I think the majority of work we do in compliance as well is to get compliance happening rather than to punish. So if we see actions taking place that we regulate, that generally the biggest outcome we seek is to get that compliance happening rather than to seek punishment. There are some cases that go.
I think we need to go on.
But from a budget perspective, it might be just worth saying that, of course, the income derived from a penalty notice or a fine would not necessarily come back to the department. So it might not necessarily help our budget, it might help the treasurer, but it may not necessarily come back to us.
Well,
Deputy Curtis.
one area that the last budget allocated funding was £100,000 to the West of Ireland planning framework. And so we want to talk briefly about where some of the allocations from last year and where they look next year and where they will exist. So I know we talked about this in our quarterly hearing. We'd like to dive a little more into the budgetary elements of the allocations from last year's budget. And so the first question would be, given the budget allocated £100,000 to the West of Ireland planning framework development, first we note that's not included in this year's budget, the budget 2026. Could you advise where the money from this year has been spent, if it has been spent, and why it doesn't appear in the 2026 budget?
Okay. Well, I don't know the specific answer to the 2026 budget, but I can assure you that monies allocated were spent. But I come back to the difficulty about prioritisation, and certainly the West of Ireland was on the list, and it was their work that we are going to do. It recently got added to by the proposition about Kennervay and the parade and the precinct, and added to that. But then you start coming back to the last States Assembly where we we voted on the one parking space per unit in St Helier. And I go back to my planning policy team and they go, well, this is just another piece of work. We go, well, you know, okay, Minister, where in the list are you dropping? Is this going to the top of the list? Or in which case, West of Ireland will once again be dropping down. And it's just an ongoing challenge to prioritise things and to decide in which order we do them. And you know, I've tried to get the list together to make sure we get these pieces of work done before the election. But more recently, I've been saying to officers, right, here's a list that's going to get started in Purda that the next minister can pick up on. And, you know, we're now working on the Purda list, if you like, because the list between now and the election is absolutely chock-a-block. And how we'll get through it, I don't know. Yeah. And before long, I'll be setting work for the next minister to do because I'll be out of the Purda. I'll be into sort of August, September, October. You know, we have a massive amount of work that we just have to roll over. And,
the analogy is like it's like the top 10 in the music hit parade. You know, we might have a new number one, which effectively means the previous number one goes down to a number two. And you know, we're constantly juggling the list of priorities as to what guidance comes out of the pipeline first. And if a new priority comes in, that may well take precedence over something else, and the list gets jogged down a bit.
My question was going to be, what's the budgetary impact of decisions like the last States Assembly decision on revision to the supplementary planning guidance on parking? You're suggesting it's about priority. I guess the question is, how will you prioritise, or will you actually seek budget changes or staffing changes to facilitate the delivery of your workload?
Well, one thing that has happened in the policy team recently, planning policy team, is that we've finally got up to the numbers, and it's interesting you say that, but we're back up to the numbers that we should have been at for quite a while. So we do have a bit more capacity in the team now, and so some of this work will start to happen. But West of Ireland particularly is one of those that we would normally be engaging a consultant from the UK, a specialist in this type of work, to come over and help and do the initial work and then feed into us. But that needs to be done. I mean, I am under no illusions that the West of Ireland planning framework is one of those important pieces of work that needs to feed into the next Island Plan debate. It's got to be. It's not one that we can continually push down the list. And I personally think it's, apart from the Island Plan, it's a really important piece of work because Kennaway is an important area. The west of the island's important. We need to know how we're using or how we're proposing to use Kennaway, St Peter, St Wan's Village, and the countryside as well. We've got the airport. We've got
Given there have been allocations, given you're keen to ensure work's done, are you confident that you can submit the case in essence on any of these to go past the consulting exemptions and bring in the required expertise? Given it was a States Assembly decision.
I wouldn't say I'm confident. You know, we are the only way to really deliver on budget reductions and staff reductions, you know, post reductions, is to be tough. And you know, if you know, we put in a consultancy freeze, and I could come up with half a dozen areas where I could quite easily justify to myself that I need consultants to help me with really important work. But that has to go on, you know, those applications go to the chief exec and the chief minister. And, you know, it may be that from a government perspective, there's other more important things.
Generally, in making those decisions, if we've got CSP backing, so to speak, we have funds to do the work, and it's a high
assembly
risk.
Backing.
Assembly decision is state assembly
curious.
decision is an important part of that equation. So that will rank higher in a consultancy question rather than something that doesn't have that backing.
Okay. And lastly, do you have any funding to spend outside of your department and capacity within policy for work on the next Bridging Island Plan, and in particular any areas that you might be bringing following changes to the law that you're consulting on at the moment for example, partial revisions? Are you confident work will be done in 26?
The very short answer to do I have any funding for the next Island Plan? No. Let's be clear, this is not passing the buck or kicking the can, but the Island Plan, the next Island Plan is a decision for the next government. I would very much hope that the new minister, whoever that is, will say, right, one of the first things they will do is to go to the council of ministers and say, we should be doing a new Island Plan. I want permission to kick this work off. But if we go for a similar type of plan approach to the one we have currently, That's £1 million worth of work, I would think, and that will need to be funded. That can't be funded from within the department's budget. It's too extraordinary an item on the balance sheet to not be funded in-house. But one of the questions we're asking in the consultation, as you know, Deputy, is around what type of plan do people think we should have? Should we carry on with our plan-led approach? Should we look to other jurisdictions where they do things differently? We could look for two different types of, the two-plan approach, where you have a very much more general overarching plan, which has only changed very occasionally.
Yeah.
And I think we'll focus on that in the next quarterly hearing ahead of
Okay.
that bringing that to the Assembly. But I think for that final question is there the budget enough, or is it protected enough, or is the posts of the people who will be doing the work protected enough to be able to finalise some of those big ticket items on the Bridging Island plan, that actions that are still kind of out there that need to be done ahead of any island, like launch of any whatever future island plan looks like. Is there enough allocation and people, and even if somebody left, would there be new allocation to ensure that money to be able to get the posts filled to be able to do that work before the island plan? Is it
I am
high up on the
confident that we
agenda?
have enough officers of enough quality to do the work in-house that we would need to do.
And you'll be able to refill those posts.
However, it's a big however, and it's the but word, but we need to mix that up with all the other things that will come down the line, all the other propositions that will be approved in the States Assembly, all the other pieces of work that we need to do. And a lot of it is unknown at the moment, but certainly we have a team capable of doing the work. Whether we will have enough time in their already full timetable.
I suppose
I don't know.
our big question here, before I move on to more on the climate neutral roadmap, is the in weighing up all these risks, and we're hearing a lot about it's the unknown. There is a budget that was a limited budget, means that mainly staff will, as they leave, potentially those posts won't get filled again. We have not able to buy in extra support to be able to cover all the elements that sit under your portfolio, Minister. And I suppose the question is, how do you take those decisions for that? What's at the top of the charts? What's at the top of the list? How does that happen? Is there how do you assess that the risk to Jersey, that from both the environmental risk, operational risk, reputational risk, economic risk, the sustainability risk, I suppose, as a whole? Like how are those done when there needs to be put at the top of the list?
Well, I go back to the answer I gave previously. I sit down with officers and we talk about everything in the round, and we usually come up with a sort of a hit list, if you like, of what has to be done and what we will have to defer for now until another time where we have more money or resource. And then, depending on the seriousness of that question, I would go to the Council of Ministers and say, this is my proposals. They may disagree with me and say that, no, we'd like this done more, and I can argue my case. I may be told, no, we'd prefer this to happen. It's just a question. We just talk about it and work together and work our way through. But I think the point I'm making is we can see the dark clouds on the horizon are starting to roll in at the moment. We have we talk about obligatory work, statutory work, pieces of work we need to do before the island plan, regulation that we're having to start doing because of changes which come through the Assembly. Everywhere we look at the moment, we have challenges. And as I say, we're now, from a budget perspective, at a point where, in order to make the savings that we as a government have decided to make, we're having to look at vacancies, because that's where we have to go next. We've no more, we can't find any more money down the back of the sofa, so to speak. So we're coping, but it's mighty tough.
I'd say, with the Minister, we meet weekly. There is a constant dialogue as to what what's on the list this week, you know, has something taken greater priority than something else? In terms of a simple risk equation, are we seeing issues that are affecting the island's ability to trade? Are we seeing the islanders' health? Are we seeing untoward impacts happening in the island we have to respond to? Those things absolutely would be higher priority to other maybe education work or research work or guidance work, which may well be more nice to haves. And I think it's literally a constant
I
dialogue.
mean, in the environment section, for example, let's just think about that for a minute. Climate change is doing what it says. It's changing the climate. We have a greater threat now for invasive species, particularly invasive insects, if you like, and just blue tongue or lumpy skin disease in cattle. I'm so much more likely now. We started for the first time, we did a program of vaccinations for blue tongue last year, which cost us money. But the industry, working with the department and myself, came to the conclusion that we thought the threat from blue tongue was serious enough to the island herd that we needed to do something about it. So we've taken that decision. But, plants and animals are under great threat from climate change.
And I think we can move on that area
Exactly.
because I think, Minister, it's
Going
important.
to cheer you up a bit more now. So, so how much revenue currently flows into the Climate Emergency Fund from environmental taxation compared with the levels originally forecast at its launch?
Well, I have Michelle
Put the number together and I'd
who
say-
has all the numbers, but
So what accounts for the shortfall is I'm going to give you a little preempt on these ones and how will the department address this gap to ensure the carbon neutral roadmap delivery remains on track?
Okay, so you'll have seen in the budget documentation that there is the projection for 26 to 29 with regard to the income that is expected. To note that that includes the proposed increases to VED from January. So that is composed of 9 pence per litre on fuel duty on all fuels except HVO, and then the proportion that we have above the RPI, recent increases above RPI on the non-commercial vehicles that are subject to VED. So that has been, there's been a trend of decline over time, and that is largely due to falling fuel duty receipts. And we know that that is going to happen as a consequence of our policies, both to support the transition to electric vehicles and the increased use of active travel and sustainable transport modes. So there is an overall societal trend that we are going to see falling receipts. And we know that that's been looked at by the economy team to see, at the moment, their projection was that there would be no steep sort of cliff edge at any point in the next couple of years, but it is being maintained as an area that needs to be under a watching brief with respect to a fuel duty replacement policy, which is a piece of work that's been rolled over to the next year. So we can see in terms of the forecast that we've got for the next budget period that we're going to recover some of the loss against falling fuel duty through additionality in VED, but it is still a trend that will decline over time. And we're very clear that that is not going to cover the overall amount of money that will be needed for our net zero transition. So we're now looking at a year-on-year basis for the funding that we know will come in. And next year, with respect to the second delivery period, which will be from 2027 to 2030, the next 4-year period, that we will put forward a net zero financing strategy to support the delivery of the policy developments and implementation that will happen in that period. We're not going to look at a fully costed model that takes you all the way to 2050. There are some levels of technology that it will be rather foolish for us to try and predict at this point. So we're going to take that in tranches. So the Assembly can expect to see the policies for that 4-year period and how we intend to pay for them. And where that is over and above this forecast, we will need additional measures, whether they are through pulling government levers or through accessing commercial or private funding. That is things we will bring to the Assembly.
A bit of the question really was, what alternatives are supplementing the funding? Can you give any concrete examples you'd like to say to top this up and make sure that those revenue
There is
streams
nothing confirmed at this point that I would be able to brief you on.
Okay.
We are obviously aware that there are actions that are being taken through largely our finance industry, and also there are other corporates they will be going on their own net zero journey, and so they are taking actions that the government does not need to fund, but that is contributing to the reduction in our emissions. So we're very conscious that there are some really excellent activities going on across the business sector already.
I think I might just add,
Yeah.
Deputy, I mean, certainly looking ahead and in the immediate past, I've been using carrots to encourage people
Yes, yeah.
in the climate change world. And I have indicated that sometime in the future we will have to start combining carrots and sticks. But in the short term, I would very much want to continue with the carrot approach. But to do that, I need income. I need income coming into the fund. And as Michelle has said, it's decreasing for a number of reasons. The first one is, as she said, we're burning less liquid carbon fuel on island year on year. Engines are becoming more efficient, and more people are moving to electric vehicles. So it's also almost self-defeating. We'd like a little bit more per litre. That's always a challenge because obviously as a government we don't want to put the price of fuel up any more than we really have to. But fortunately, I have managed to persuade colleagues that adding over and above the two, in fact, in some cases, large percentages to the emissions duty in the higher rates where we have large fuel-consuming vehicles, larger vehicles, we've been adding to the BED in those sections considerably for a number of years, and I think we'll probably if we can continue to do that.
I've got a kind of bunch of questions here, but you're pretty much answering a whole load of the questions which I've got lined up here. So, I mean, my question really is ultimately, is this something which the private sector is going to help deliver on this 2050 target? Is this something which, businesses themselves, because of what their activities are, becoming more green, are they going to actually facilitate this significantly? It's actually not going to be government who's going to need to keep putting up taxes or putting up this or putting up that. Is it actually?
I think we are living in a world of corporate responsibility, and certainly the larger corporates absolutely get that, and they are doing their bit. They realise, in practical terms, the cost or the carbon emissions from heating their premises, where they have large offices or what have you. They're looking at that. They're looking at investing in sustainable energy, green initiatives, if you like, and the Sustainable Energy Awards, Sustainable Finance Awards that we've had for the last couple of years. There's some really good ideas coming out of the financial sector, services sector about the environment.
I'm just kind of saying it's not always about government doing stuff. It's about
I think people are getting their responsibilities across the whole board.
Focusing on the budget and just going back to the vehicles emissions duty. Obviously, it was the panel successfully amended last year's budget to increase those percentages. Do you, Minister, just hearing in general, you said the last few years, but do you believe that this year's increase as well it goes far enough to influence that behaviour? So it's not just, of course it's about polluter pays and it's about influencing behaviour, the vehicle emissions duty. Do you think that this current proposal for this year's budget goes far enough?
If I was extreme, I would say it never goes far enough. But I think one's got to be realistic, and the percentage increases we're putting on these large vehicles year on year are double digit, and there is no doubt in my mind that is having an effect on some people and the vehicles they purchase. It's also clear that in some instances with these high-end, expensive, large fuel-consuming vehicles, it doesn't appear to make any difference to the number that we're selling. So we may have to look elsewhere. But what am I trying to say? A few extra £1,000 doesn't seem to make much difference to some purchasing in some sectors of the car market.
No, and so do you think that maybe there is room there to maybe increase that top end? To maybe make even more increases, knowing that we just talked about the fact that for the fuel duty percent, which of course we are talking, we know there is that need of the polluter pays, but also to have supporting this transition and to be fair, whether then that one side the fuel duty maybe not going up as fast, but maybe as a response for those very big vehicles and luxury vehicles, maybe they need a bit more of an increase.
Well, the other side to this is we do need to remember this is all about saving carbon. This is all about the environment. And if we think by doing what we're doing, we're going to stop large vehicles coming in, of course we're wrong, because a lot of these large vehicles you can now buy an electric version of. So, of course, there's no VED to be paid on a very large vehicle, which is an electric one.
We're talking about the polluter pays principle, but including a just transition, it's important.
We've got to continue to look at that. Yes, absolutely. As the alternatives become available, there's no reason for us not to do that, because the whole idea is that we don't want to put things out of people's reach. So that they say, well, I can't buy this, and there's no alternative for me to go to. There's no doubt by the time we get to 2030, every car manufacturer will be offering a complete range of vehicles that are fully electric, because that's the way they're going, and that's going to help us with our task. The downside of that, of course, is the money we get into our VED will reduce dramatically, because the number of vehicles coming in will be much, much slower.
Yeah. Continuing on with the polluter pays, there's a proposal within the budget entitled Carbon Tax or Charges on Private Aircraft. Are you satisfied that the charges introduced by Ports of Jersey meets the intent of the polluter pays?
I'm happy with the position we find ourselves in with ports. We did a lot of work on looking at that in-house, and we found that was going to come quite labour intensive, take a lot of work. We weren't quite sure how we would implement it. It was going to certainly need some law drafting input and all sorts of things. And we ended up talking to ports and saying, look, there's a very simple way of doing this. You can just increase your charges for this type of aircraft. And we were satisfied that ports came up with a proposal which guaranteed that income would be put to decarbonising ports. And certainly as Minister, I'm fully on board with that. I think if Ports of Jersey can go away and promote themselves as a neutral carbon or whatever they are, the more we can help them, the better. But we have oversight, or some oversight, over the money that they get in from that additional charging, and they will be showing us and guaranteeing to us that money is going into saving carbon within ports. So we took the view, whether ports are saving carbon over here or we're saving carbon over here, the important thing is saving carbon. So we were happy to go with what seemed like a very straightforward answer to what could have been quite a complicated question.
And it would have taken a lot longer for government to implement that if we'd gone through something that required legislation. We know that ports started increasing their charges in May of this year, and I understand that they'd already collected £180,000 through that increase, and that will be fully ring-fenced for their own decarbonisation roadmap. So that has allowed them to find a really good and sustainable mechanism through their own customers that they can pursue their goals of being both green airport and harbours. So I think that's going to be very positive for them, and it also means we may not get some funding requests that might come across for certain elements of their transition, because they've now got that mechanism.
Has there been any discussion around marine fuel or marine charges in the same breath? Because obviously we see.
Well, certainly marine fuel is something which gets mentioned at regular intervals. I've had an email about marine fuel only this week. We talk about it, and I think the reason we haven't gone there yet is that we're trying to concentrate on the big numbers, and the big numbers are in road transport and housing. But marine fuel is something we need to look at. It's just a small, I can't remember the percentage numbers, but it's not a big number in the big scheme of things, which is why we haven't really targeted it.
Okay. And so what oversight or assurance mechanisms are in place to verify that funds raised through this charge are being used as intended and are delivering measurable emissions reductions in line with the carbon neutral roadmap?
Well, I'll hand over to Michelle, but all the money goes into the emergency fund and the schemes which the CEF funds are very specific.
Clarify, the question was relating to the Ports of Jersey charging.
I think it can be a bit of both, really, because we need to. It's an island-wide and environmental-wide issue. So if there are mechanisms that you can support,
as I said before, I think we have good communication, but we also have oversight on what they're doing.
And they have committed to reports, so their annual reports will come out. They've published their decarbonisation roadmap. That's a publicly available document, and we would expect to see good and robust reporting about the changes that they've been able to make through that time series.
Okay. And then for this CEF, the carbon neutral.
We report on the delivery of the carbon neutral roadmap on an annual basis. The most recent report was published in the summer. You'll also be aware that we have the first Independent Climate Council for the island was recently convened. They came to the island, those who are off island, and had their initial briefing meetings at the beginning of October, and they're due to report back to the Assembly by the Minister by the end of Q1, aware that Chair and the Minister have met with them. They will be reporting on the island's progress with respect to how we have implemented the carbon neutral roadmap, and also our progress towards the emissions reduction targets under the Paris Agreement. So we've got external scrutiny, we've got your own facet of scrutiny, and we've got the reports that government is publishing with respect to the progress made and how the funds are spent.
Will they be also commenting on income generation, or from all the financing strategies? So I suppose from
I
both
would be
these issues,
surprised if they did
funds
not.
raised.
Yeah, okay. I won't dwell on it, but I know, Chair, that you've met them as well. But can I say I was hugely impressed with the quality of the people who responded to the invitation to come on the Climate Council. We've got a real top team. I'm looking forward to what they've got to say.
I think I asked that question mainly because as a budget, this being a budget meeting, knowing that the future will have some comments on related to how to fund the carbon neutral roadmap and
Well, I'm
issues in the future.
I'm very
is
much
important.
hopeful the Climate Council won't find anything in the way we use the funds, because it's all governed. We have strict governance rules
Yes.
about what can be spent from the emergency fund. A senior reporting officer has
No, I meant the
responsibility.
future,
Yeah.
how to fund it, but sorry.
Okay, so I'll take my last question here, which is, Minister, that in the proposed budget, there's £250,000 put for progressing the policy development on the offshore wind. Can you give more of an explanation for what these funds are going to be spent on?
Yes and no. That, unfortunately, is an error in the accounts. It was pointed out to the Treasury team at the time, but I think we'll all understand that they were under immense pressure in the final days before publication, and for some reason it didn't get taken out, so that money will be corrected, that correction will be published, and so that money won't be there, but I will be making a statement to the Assembly and publishing something before the end of the month on wind, at which point I will explain why and how that is going to happen.
Okay.
Thank you. And Conatar, your last
Yes,
few
one
questions.
quick question for me on environmental well-being pack. The Powell notes that the climate emergency has been removed as an environmental well-being risk within the sustainable well-being section of the budget. This prompts the obvious question as to whether the government's risk appetite or escalation process for climate-related issues has changed.
Well, we have a number of risk registers, as I understand it. Obviously, there's a corporate risk register which talks about government's ability to respond to events. There is an environmental risk register which will highlight the things like blue tongue, foot and mouth disease, environmental disasters, and the risk of those happening. And then there's a community risk register which sums up everything, or is it just?
Yeah, we have a community risk in issues facing the island as a whole, and we have more than corporate risk and departmental risk registers which affect us as a business in our own right. So one relates to the other, but our greatest risk is how we can respond to events that we see in the community.
Okay, so just focusing on the term climate emergency risk, are you saying that's encompassed within the community risk, or?
So certainly in the community risk, the risk hasn't gone away, and we are seeing increasing risks related to the climate, whether it be weather, disease, pests, so on and so forth, cooling, heating. All of those risks are apparent in society. There's always a debate to be had in government on the degree that we think those risks are occurring now or will occur in the future. So it's often that, but the risks aren't going away.
I think the main question is why is it out of the budget documentation? We have the well-being island outcome indicators, and then we have the well-being community economic
Page 16.
and environmental well-being focus area. And in the last budget, climate emergency was very much there as part of one of the risks. And now under environment, we only have one, which is lack of capacity for waste disposal and management. That's the only within the budget. That's the only risk that has been highlighted. And the question was from the Conatab is why climate emergency
It's dropped off
has
the
dropped
budget.
off.
Yes, that's why.
25 to 26.
I probably need to go away and have a chat with officers about it, but my initial reaction would be, I think that it will be one of those things under contingency that we're not allowing for in the budget. And if something did happen, it would be an extraordinary item and one would need to go back to
Yeah,
the Treasurer and say, this is happening, we need some money and we'll need to find it from outside.
so there's a debate to be had on using existing resources to manage our work around climate as within existing priorities, and then using climate emergency funds for those additional areas that we've highlighted through that work, but certainly no further funds or new funds for climate risk.
But I just get back to the word risk and percentages and ratios and what's the likelihood of something happening. And I think we've decided that unless there's an absolute imminent risk in whatever we're talking about, we're not going to budget for it.
The question basically is, does the omission or the change mean that climate emergency no longer has the priority it had? And you're effectively saying...
I wouldn't say that from the perspective of the risk register, it's certainly still an absolute top priority for us. But I think what we're saying in the risk register is that we think the imminent possibility of something environmentally happening is not that great, not that high, that we need to put it in, given, of course, that we've got a huge number of challenges and priorities to put in. Doesn't mean to say there isn't a risk, but I think it's got to get to a level before it goes on there.
And we've got the climate referred to in the CSP, so certainly we've got a state's decision on this, we've got it in the CSP. There's an assumption that we're using existing resources to progress work in this area, but certainly responses to climate risk will have to be dealt with as they occur from a budget perspective.
Sorry.
I think it's just quite interesting for the panel to look at the purpose of the budget, including risks as part of economic, environmental, community well-being, and not including this one. And to take examples, an economic well-being risk area is future economic growth not meeting the needs of Ireland government revenues and living standards. That seems to be kind of one of those long-term risks, just like the climate emergency. The budget is there to describe the mitigations, and it feels like the last year's mitigations for climate emergency, that of shoreline management, addressing funding into the carbon neutral roadmap, haven't changed. So I think the question from the panel is, what's different this year? And ultimately, should this actually exist within the budget 2026, like last year?
If I might point you to page 45 of the budget, there is some narrative which explains that the identification of the specific funded interventions for certain risks are where they have been outside of risk appetite for the Council of Ministers. So I think it is not to say that other risks do not exist, but there is specific funding allocation around specific risks, such as this area with respect to waste disposal and management, where it was felt that something additional was needed. I can only comment to that.
And I think specifically to the budget, if we have a certain amount of money available, how much of that do we want to allocate to a risk that we think might not happen in 2026? So it's all a perception. I mean, we could say this is imminent, we're almost definitely sure it's going to happen, and it's a big risk, we need some funding for it. But given the challenges that we have across the piece at the moment, would it be prudent to say we want to allocate some of those desperately needed funds for something we're not quite sure is going to happen?
I suppose it's coming back to Deputy Curtis' point about what was said last year, which is talking about within the climate emergency, obviously there's mitigation and there's adaptation. And one of the things was adaptation. It's about the shoreline management plan, alleviating coastal flooding. And we heard from the Minister of Infrastructure on Monday about the fact that there cannot be the amount of funding for the shoreline management plan is beyond the way the budget is set, and there is much more money needed than that. And of course, he highlighted that a future government may put that as a lower priority to fund the beginning of the shoreline management plan. And I suppose our question as a scrutiny is, especially in a changing environment next year where the governments potentially could change, whether that needs to again be highlighted as a risk into the future about needing to the budget that's assigned for shoreline management plan, whether it's within the fund, it's within the funding or not, or the business as usual needs to be funded, because this is a big risk, because it is climate emergencies happening, we will be seeing increases in
It's
flooding.
difficult for me to disagree with what you're saying there, and I think it probably needs to be looked at. All I would say is that any long-term plan, and you use shoreline management, certainly one, and carbon, meeting our aspirations for carbon is another. When you come with a 20 or 30-year plan, it's just so easy to just say, oh, we'll start next year, we'll start next year, we'll start next year, because the vision is so deep. But I think you're absolutely right. I think if you've got a 30-year plan, you've got to be chunking it up and saying, we will do that. We will. You've got to start allowing for the expenditure. I mean, how are we going to?
Yeah, it's a very hard.
Needs to be spoken about.
It's the balance that all government plans have to face in terms of investing into immediate reactive costs now or reactive issues that we have now, versus investing in proactive work to avoid future reactive costs. And that is effectively where we are with the climate debate. We know that our costs around climate impacts will increase. They may not increase immediately next year or the year after that, but they are certainly increasing with the trends we're seeing. So there's always a balance to strike to, and how much do we invest in that proactive work to avoid that reactive cost in 20 years' time when we have reactive issues right now.
I mean,
that's the debate.
In the current climate, and I don't want to aim this at Andy particular at all, but we have a massive plan to upgrade our sewer network. Now it's going to be very expensive. It's going to be very
And that's here, so it's okay,
challenging.
Minister.
Sorry?
It is mentioned.
Yes,
in
but
there.
all I'm saying is we might have looked at it 10 years ago and said, we've got all this work to do. We need to start chunking it up into annual or 2-year and do a bit every year. But the infrastructure department have been just replacing and maintaining rather than upgrading, where we know we've got a sewage system which is decades old, designed for 70,000 people.
No, well, and thank you, Minister, and thank you for that. But we've been 5 minutes over, and thank you very much for giving us that extra time. And I'd like to thank Minister, officers, and panel and officers supporting us to this scrutiny panel. So